Good afternoon, everybody, or good evening for those of you joining us from Europe, or good day in whichever world time zone you find yourself. My name is José Casanova, and I am an emeritus professor in sociology, theology, and religious studies at Georgetown University, and a senior fellow at the Berkley Center for Religious Peace and World Affairs that sponsors this series. This is the 11th episode in our conversations on global and religious and secular dynamics. This event is also being co-sponsored by Reset Doc. As usual, it is being video recorded, and it will be available on YouTube very shortly, probably at the beginning of next week. We are going to follow the usual procedure. We'll have first a conversation with our guest today for about 50 minutes, and then we will open up the conversation to questions and answers from the audience. At the bottom of your screen, at the bottom, you will see the sign, question and answer. Please do write your answers at any time, and I will try to transmit these answers to our guest today. We are very fortunate, certainly I'm very grateful, to have the opportunity to have this conversation with my dear friend, Father Tomáš Halík. Father Halík, welcome. Father Halík is, I would say, a prophetic priest, a renowned Czech public intellectual, and a well-known religious thinker, recipient of the Templeton Prize. For more details on his interesting life, you can go to our website and you will find here in the event today much more information. Our conversation today is going to be based on this book. This is an autobiography written by Father Halík, the title, From the Underground Church to Freedom. And it was published by Notre Dame University Press in 2019. And I do recommend it to everybody interested in the questions of faith and secularity in our contemporary global age. Father Halík, welcome.
Welcome. So do you hear me?
Yes, we hear you well. So let's begin. Okay. Let's begin then with basically the autobiography basically narrates your own personal journey to faith from a very secular background, the Czech Republic, and also your clandestine secret journey to priesthood in the underground during the communist regime, and then obviously more beyond. But let's begin then with this journey. What makes this journey so interesting is, of course, that it is not only your personal journey, but also is very much embedded within the whole transformation of the Czech Republic during the communist regime and after, and to a certain extent, the whole transformation of modern societies. So please, tell us about this journey from secularity to faith.
Okay, so thank you for welcoming me. Hello, everybody. Welcome to my apartment in Prague. And I will start. So I was born in 1948. It was the year when the communists came to power in our country. And my father was a historian of literature. I brought up in intellectual Prague family. I was baptized as a child, but without any religious education. In that time, so the religion of my parents was secular humanism and the democracy and all these ideas of that time. The religious situation in our country was very special. I think that the communists, the Stalinists, have chosen our country as a field of an experiment of a total atheization of society. There was quite proper circumstances, conditions, because the Czechoslovakia, especially the Czech part of the country, was secularized already between the two world wars because of this very dramatic religious history of our country. Jan Hus and Hussite wars and the 5 crusades against the heretical Czechs and violent recatholicization of our country in 17th century, then the link between the Catholic Church, the majority Catholic Church, and the Austrian monarchy. So the modern Czech nationalism have some anti-clerical aspects, and the country was secularized because it was a very industrial country, urban country with a high level of education, and and the Czech nationalism was just opposite to the Polish nationalism. The Polish nationalism, there was the Catholic Church and Catholicism, a pillar of a national identity against the German Protestant and the Russian Orthodoxy. But in our country, there are some tensions between the Catholic Church, majority church, and the nation. And I think that the communists tried to use it and to deepen this atheization of the country. So the church was expelled, pushed out of this public space, practically absolutely. I have no contact with the living church, and this my conversion on or discovering the faith. It has several steps. The first steps was perhaps the aesthetic attractivity. So, you know, Prague is a very beautiful city with hundreds of beautiful churches. So the architecture and spiritual music and all the arts of the religious art in our town, in our country, it was a signal. There is something important, something attractive in this gray years of the real socialism. And then the second step was intellectual. I read the essays by Chesterton and the novels by Graham Greene. So especially the English Catholicism was very near to my heart because it was not the triumphalistic, it was the minority Catholicism, and also the French authors like Mauriac and many others. But it was the intellectual sympathy without any real connection with the living church. And when I was so about 20, in the 60s, in late 60s, I met several priests. They spent 14 years or 10 years, 11 years in prison. And they were just released from prison in the late 60s, before or during the Prague Spring, 68. And they were very interesting personalities, not broken personalities. And I think that those people discovered the spirit of the Vatican II in a very special way. You know, in our country, the reform of the Vatican II was accepted just partly, because for many priests it was just a formal thing to turn the altar, to introduce the Czech language into liturgy, but without the intellectual context, without knowing the new theology of Rahner, Ratzinger, King, Chenies, Hilbakes, and so on, it was very superficial. But those people, they discovered in prison the real ecumenism. They were in prison with the Protestant, with some non-conformist communists, with some liberals, and they dreamed in prison. They accepted this time like kairos for purification of the church from this triumphalism of the past. And they dreamed about the church. They say, oh, perhaps if we will live in free and the church will free again, it must be a different church. It must be a poor church, serving church, open church, ecumenical church. And then they received the first news about the Vatican II. They say, oh, of course, it is what we have dreamed about. So those people introduced me in this Vatican II spirituality and theology.
At some point, you decided then to become a priest, to be prepared to be ordained and to join the underground church secretly. There was, of course, the official church that was compromised by its links with the regime, controlled very much by the secret service. But then, as you point out, there were three sections of the underground church. One were those who had been priests, who had been basically thrown out of the church or actually forbidden to practice their ministry, and they had civilian professions, and they were underground practicing as priests. Then there were those who had been actually secretly ordained in preparation of the communist arrival, but had no link with Rome. They were a kind of parallel church and a very unclear situation in many, many respects. And then there were those like you that decided to be ordained through the Roman Catholic Church, and you had to go outside to East Germany, in your case, to be ordained there. And you were always in link with some bishop that basically kept you the relation with Rome. What is interesting about your decision that you decided to become a priest, but not a clerical priest having a clerical ministry, but having a civilian profession and accompanying precisely through your profession, a civilian having a pastoral, not explicit pastorate, but basically an accompaniment, a kind of underground church for the secular, for those outside the church, not within the temple, but precisely within secular society. And to a certain extent, this became then a model of a church in a secular society, even after the underground was lifted. We'll talk about this later and how close this is to the model of church, which has been to a certain extent promoted by Pope Francis. But let's basically give us some sense of your decision to join the underground church, and how did you prepare yourself for priesthood, and how did you become a priest then?
Okay, so there was just one seminar, priest seminar in Bohemia, and the second one in Bratislava for Slovakia. And the seminar was, the theological faculty was exported out of the university, out of Prague, in the city of North Bohemia. And the seminary was absolutely controlled by the state and by the secret police. It was a better time during the 68. But when I finished my study, I studied philosophy, sociology, and psychology at the Charles University. Just in this lovely 60s, late 60s, there was very interesting professors. But then came after the Russian occupation in August 68, was the situation again very bad. So it was the second period of persecution of the cultural life and also the persecution of the church, which was not so drastic like in 50s, but more sophisticated. Not so many people were in prison, or they were not for a long time or for 25 years. They were condemned for 2 years or something like that. But the secret police was everywhere, and the situation was very bad. And in that time was there this church, as you told, these three groups. The groups each priest has to have a special permission for the priest activities given by the state. It means by the secret police. And if the priests in the official church were too active and try to have some connections with the youth especially, they can lose, and the permission was taken away from them, and they have to work in like toilet cleaners or or night watchers and so on. Also, then the later Cardinal Wilk was window cleaners, and I was not allowed to teach at the university after my doctorate during this celebration of getting the doctor degree, which is very nice celebration in the great aula of the university. I got a speech, Thanksgiving, and they gave me the official speech to thank to Communist Party and so, and I put it in my pocket and I gave a spontaneous speech, and I gave thanks to the professors. They were expelled out of the university, and I say that the truth is much powerful than the power. It was a quotation from the Karel Čapek. And so I was forbidden to teach at the university, and I work as a sociologist in one factory and institute, and then I was a psychotherapist with drug abusers and alcoholics until the end of communism. And this connection between my underground priest activity and the civil job was for me not just a necessity, but as my vocation. And it was something like the working priest, the prêtre ouvrier in France. In the 50s or even earlier. And what this very open-minded bishops introduced in France, and then it was stopped by Rome in 50s. The Nabucodonosor of the communist regime introduced, imposed, and for me it was a vocation. And until now, I have my job at the secular university, and I'm a pastor of the university parish. So I find the way to the underground church, and I studied in these underground courses, seminars in the private flats. Also, some theologians from the West came to our country as a private tourist, giving us the lectures. And it was also the great personalities like today's Cardinal Schönborn or Kasper or Hans King or Jeppe Metz or many others. They came to give us sometimes, and also the philosophers like the Charles Taylor or Derrida. And sometimes there were some troubles with the secret police. It was always very demanding to organize this secretly. They came just as an anonymous tourist for 2-3 days to give the lectures to us in private flats. So it was my preparation, and then I was ordained in Erfurt in the East Germany in the private chapel of the bishop. And the next day I celebrated my first mass in a chapel of one monastery in East Germany. And it was the day of the intronization of the new Pope. So after this mass, I went with the bishop to follow the intronization mass in the West German television. And I thought myself, it was with this, fear not. And I think, oh yes, don't be afraid. And I say, oh, yes, it's a signal for me. It's a motto for my priest activity underground. And perhaps I will have someday the opportunity to tell this Pope I am probably the first priest ordained under your pontificate. And I've got this opportunity 11 years after.
So this was, of course, the Polish Pope, John Paul II. Obviously, for you, there has to be some particular providential meaning, the fact that precisely the time when you become ordained as a priest, you have the ordination or the election of a Polish Pope and a Slavic Pope from a communist regime. So what was the meaning for you personally, and what do you think was the meaning for Eastern European societies under communism to have a Slavic Pope as the Pope?
It was a great impulse because this Vatican Eastern politics was very careful and step by step, and not to provoke the communist regime and so on. There were also some compromises in Hungary, for example. This collaborators, priests were appointed bishops. It was not so bad in our country, but yes, and then came the Pope who knew the situation, and he was asked, how will be your Eastern politics? And he said, it will be not naive, because he knew the situation. So yes, it was a great symbol for us, great support.
And then you develop a personal relationship with him.
Yes.
Eventually, you came to Rome. You had dinner with him, a private dinner at the Vatican, only 4 of you. And it was at this dinner that actually, I understand, the Pope told you to be prepared, you and the Czech Church, because the end of communism, the end of communism was coming, not only in East Germany, where it was evident, but throughout. And then you became very much involved later in the preparation of the trip of the Pope to the Czech Republic. So can you basically tell us about how this personal relationship developed and what it meant for you, and then what it meant the first visit of the Pope to the Czech Republic?
Okay, so when I work in underground, even my mother was not allowed to know that I am a priest, and it was so secretly. But I've got in underground some relations with our Archbishop Tomášek. He was almost 90, and I prepared some of his speeches and open letters to government when he became hero in the 80s. And some bishops and cardinals from West came to visit him. And my task was to accompany them, to show them the beauty of Prague. And it was the opportunity to tell them something about the real situation, because the Archbishop Palais was full of microphones of the secret police. I remember that Cardinal Marx told me that he visited Tomášek and he asked him, Eminency, could we speak freely here? And Tomášek said, yes. So and then came the Cardinal Lustiger, the Archbishop of Paris, and I accompanied him, and I told him much about the underground church and about some of my visions for the future of the church in our country, in the Central Europe. And he said, oh, it's very interesting. You must tell this to the Holy Father. And I answered, Eminence, it is easy for you. You are Archbishop of Paris. I'm unknown psychologist in the communist Czechoslovakia. I have no passport, I have no visa, and so. And he said, oh, we must pray for it. And in 89, before the end, it was a little bit the time of perestroika, and there was the canonization of Agnes of Prague in Rome. And we were allowed 11,000 Czech and Slovak pilgrims to go to Rome. And I went to Rome. I was some days before, and one day I put a walk in Trastevere in Rome. It was rain. And I met the Cardinal Listiger in Rome in the street. And he said, oh, yes, so you are here. So please send a letter to the Holy Father and ask him for a private audience. I did it through one Czech exiled bishop, Jaroslav Škarvada, and then came the invitation for a dinner. And it was November the 7th, 2 days before the fall of Berlin Wall. And the Pope first asked me, in which language we will speak? And I answered Polish, perhaps German or English. Or he said, oh, you speak wonderfully Polish. Ksiądz bardzo pięknie mówi po polski. And I said, Holy Father, it is not Polish, it is the Pan-Slavic Esperanto. And he said, yeah, so Pan-Slavic Esperanto. And he came just from TV, and it was 2 days before the fall of the Berlin Wall. There was some uprising already. And he said, this is the end of communism. And I said, Holy Father, excuse me, I don't believe that the papal infallibility does work in all political affairs. I think there will be some perestroika 5. No, you must be prepared. You will be free very soon. And it came in 10 days. I don't know if he was informed by the Holy Spirit or by the CIA or by the Holy Spirit through the CIA, I don't know. But it so happened, and it was very interesting, almost 2 hours conversation. And then I returned, and in 1 week, the regime was destroyed in this Velvet Revolution. And then the Bishop Škarvada, which accompanied me to the Holy Father, came after 40 years to Czechoslovakia, and we visited together Václav Havel. 3 days before his, or 5 days before his election to the president. This is the photo from this, I don't know if you can see it, of this our meeting. It was in the center of so-called civic forum. It was day before the Christmas Eve, and Václav Havel said, "Yes, if I would be elected, I would like to invite the Holy Father to visit our country, and it would be nice if it could be before the first free elections next year, so in 2-3 months." And the bishop said, "Oh, it's nonsense. There's such of journey and such of trip. The pontifical trip is prepared for 3 years in Vatican." But he returned, Bishop Škarvada. He was invited again to the Holy Father, and he told him about our conversation with Havel, and he said, why not? But I must have an official invitation. So the Bishop Škarvada called me the same evening and said, I just spoke with the Holy Father, and he said it would be possible, the visit very soon, but he must receive an official invitation. So I went next day to the new president, and he wrote on the same day the official invitation, and then came the Archbishop Colasuono to Prague and brought me an invitation by the Holy Father to go to Vatican and to prepare this visit. And I spent 1 month in Vatican. Almost every day I've got the opportunity to speak with the Pope. I have some photos from that times. You know if it is, and this is, yeah, and he prepared himself very deeply because it was his first visit in the post-communist world. And so it became our personal relationship. Then he appointed me a counselor to the Pontifical Commission for the Dialogue with the Non-Believers. And until his death, when I was in Rome, I was always the possibility to come and to spend him very often the dinner and a conversation about the situation. So he's very deep in my memories and in my heart.
Obviously, you work with non-believers, the pontificate. You had worked with the sick, with the unbelievers, but you also had developed your own charisma as a priest, an interreligious dialogue.
Yes.
The religious dialogue, first of all, with the Protestants because of Jan Hus and the Czech tradition, the Czech national tradition, but also with the Jewish community in Prague, and because of the history of the Jewish community in Prague, you had developed a very close relationship with the Jewish community. Then you develop a relationship with the Dalai Lama and with Buddhism. As you point out in your autobiography, you may be the only person whose beard was touched gently by both, by the Dalai Lama and by Pope Francis. Both of them touch your beard. Yes, this is indeed a beautiful picture. But you also had, yes, you also had close relations with the community of Taizé in France. You had religious pilgrimages to Israel, to India, to Nepal, to Japan, Hiroshima. So tell us about why is interreligious dialogue so important for you?
I think it is the main task of the church now. It is a sign of the time. We are already a global church, and we must be the instrument of the human fraternity. Pope Francis is speaking about it, and not only speaking. So, and I think the Prague is very proper place for such a dialogue. Of course, the dialogue with the Protestant because of Jan Hus. I inspired also this conference about Jan Hus on the eve of the new millennium. I spoke about it with Václav Havel. He joined this conference and with the Pope, and the Pope has his very important speech about Jan Hus on this conference, and then with the Jews, of course, there is a very small religious community, Jewish religious community in Prague, but historically it was a very important intellectual center of Judaism, not only the religious, also the secular. Franz Kafka and so on is connected with Prague, and then with Buddhist. It was so nice this meeting with Dalai Lama. I met him first in Switzerland. But I just joined his meeting with some Tibetan people, and I saw this man has a very special radiation. And then then he was invited by Václav Havel for this conferences Forum 2000 to Prague several times, and I organized this interreligious part of this conference. So we became friends with Dalai Lama. It was lovely. I remember his first visit, and they were the journalists expecting some very important speech with some deep Oriental wisdom, and the Dalai Lama said, everybody needs laugh. The small monkey laughs the old monkey. The mother monkey laughs the small monkey, ha 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 ha. And they were shocked. So what he is saying, it's sometimes very simple, but his personality, his personal radiation, it's a man who is absolutely free from narcissism, for egocentrism. He overcomes his ego. I think he's like the opposite, like the Donald Trump. When I see the Donald Trump, the first time, I think it's a reincarnation of Mussolini with all these gestures and faces and so. And the Dalai Lama is just the opposite, just the man who takes himself not serious. He's free from egocentrism, and it is the radiation of the inner liberty, and. So it was, and so the Interreligious, I was not allowed for 20 years to go abroad outside of this socialist camp, and but after I was invited to give some lectures and to have some lecture tours and some study tours, and I visited all 6 continents, even Antarctica, and I wrote about it in my book. But I always try to meet and to discuss with the people of different culture and different religions, because it is important to study Buddhism, but also to meet the Buddhists. Without the study of the sources of the intellectual background, we cannot understand deeply the other cultures. But without meeting the people in their own encounter, in their own milieu, it is also superficial. So I visited so many these interreligious conferences, but you know, it's a little bit artificial situation. So there is a subculture. The people say they are the dialogists. They understand each other very good, and they have very few contact on the grassroots of their own religious community. So it's important to go there, to go to different countries, different cultures, different continents, and to meet the people. So I meet so many countries, many all the continents, and I think it's very important to exchange our ideas. We live in the global world, but tolerance is not enough. We must share our experiences, and there is only 2 possibilities. There will be the clash of civilizations, or the civitas ecumenica, or the culture of ecumenism. And this ecumenism, it is the task of our time.
Well before Francis developed a model of a church as a field hospital for the wounded, you had such a model of church because you work with drug addicts, with basically alcoholics, and because your model of church was not to wait for people to come to church, but for you to go out to accompany the seekers, the unbelievers. And so you are very much a Pope Francis priest. You were a priest, a John Paul II priest. So how can you tell the people that, because today much problem of the Catholic Church is that Pope Francis priests sometimes are not, don't look positively on previous popes and vice versa. So tell us about what it is, how do we need to be an open church, which kind of global Catholic Church should we aspire to?
So I believe that the Holy Spirit is working in the church and also in this papal elections, and there were the great popes for the special time. So the John Paul II was a good pope for this time. He helped this also the political development, for the unification of Europe, for the fall of communism, and so many things. The community with Jews and so on. This tradition of the meetings in Assisi, it's a great thing, and I think this is one of the main images of the 20th century, the Pope with Dalai Lama and with the representatives of all religions in Assisi. So he was the right Pope at that time. he wouldn't be a good pope for this time. The history is changing very quickly. And also the Pope Benedict was a good bridge between these two. And I think John Paul and Benedict, they closed, they closed with honesty the long period of the church history when the main task was the confrontation with modernity. And I think the good result was the interview of Ratzinger year before his election to be Pope with Jürgen Habermas in Munich and the Catholic Academy. And they both agree that secular humanism and Christianity need each other to overcome the one-sidedness. So that this compatibility between the secular humanism and the Christian humanism is very important for Europe and not only for Europe. So I think this Pope, they closed with great dignity this period of church history, but now is a new period. Now is the postmodern global time, and I think the Pope Francis is the right man for this time, the great prophet of the church. I'm not now preparing my book about so-called afternoon of Christianity. I use the metaphor inspired by Carl Gustav Jung. Jung wrote that the human life is like a day. The childhood and youth is the morning, and it's a time to develop our image, our role in the society. And then came the midday crisis, and after is the afternoon, the time for a spiritual deepening. And I think I try to apply this model on the history of Christianity. I think from the very beginning until the modernity, it was the morning of the church history. It was the time to build the institutional structures, the doctrinal structures, and then came modernity, the secularity, atheism, death of God, and all this. What was very important it was like a dark night in the mystical teaching. It was a purification of the church, and then I think we are now at the threshold of this afternoon Christianity, and we need to go deeper to have the broader and deeper ecumenism, and to develop the new and more intensive spirituality, but not just spirituality for the inner life, also the inspiration of our presence in the global society. And I think the Pope Francis is the great prophet of this new time, and this idea of the church as a field hospital is a great inspiration for me. I try to develop it because I think he's got some intuitions, and there's a task for theologians to develop these intuitions, to think farther, even deeper. And also this idea of the field hospital, I think the church should develop some sort of therapy, but also the prevention, the immunity system in the world. In the world, there is so many fake news and nationalism and populism and all these spiritual diseases. We need the immunity system against this spiritual and moral disease. And then also the rehabilitation after, especially after the regimes like the communism or the apartheid. I saw it in South Africa. The spirituality needs reconciliation, and it is the spiritual task of the Christian, but we have not the monopoly for healing the world. We need the alliance with other religions, with some open-minded secular people, and perhaps there should be an alliance of open-minded, deeper thinking people over all the borders between cultures and religions. And it could be allies against the fanatism, fundamentalism, populism, and all what is so dangerous in our world.
Besides functioning as professor of sociology at the Charles University, you also function as university chaplain at Salvator Church, the Church of the Savior, the historic Jesuit Church of the Clementinum, the famous college, Jesuit College in Prague. There you've gathered a community of seekers. I was fortunate to precisely visit you a year ago under your invitation, and I had the opportunity to participate in the Eucharist on the evening, Sunday evening, and I saw you could experience. This is a different model of church that you don't see in, let's say, in the United States. Basically, you have a large catechumenate, adults preparing themselves for baptism, and it's a very different experience of church. What it is that led you to this, not to become just a regular priest in a regular parish, but precisely to serve as a parish for the seekers, for atheists, for unbelievers, and to work to develop a catechumenate form of Christianity in this secular society.
I'm very happy that I'm in this church, the Jesuit Church. I'm not a Jesuit, but I'm so near to the Jesuit all the time that once I was in Spain and I spoke with one Basque lady, and she told me, you don't tell me that you are not a Jesuit. My family is 400 years connected with the Jesuit. I have a nose for them. You don't tell me that you are not a Jesuit. So until that time, I'm saying I'm a Jesuit anonymous. I'm an anonymous Jesuit. So I'm very happy in this church, and I'm also very happy in this secular country. And I'm also very happy if I can surprise the visitors like you, the people saying, oh, this is the most atheistic country in the world, and now the church is packed by the young people. And I baptize myself more than 2,000 adults, and we have 2 years catechumenate, very deep going. And it is possible. It is possible if if our Christianity is not an ideology, if it is not something which is imposed to the people, which is the invitation, open invitation for open-minded people, and dialogue with the culture. We try to read the inculturation, to have the sensibility for the real questions of the people. Sometimes the priests are saying, oh, now we put ask the question, and they put the question which nobody asks. So we must recognize the real question of the people and to try with them to seek the answers, not to have all the ideology of the prepared answers. We must go together and deep, and that the faith is a way to go to the depth. So very important is to put together 3 elements. One element is the intellectual. So there must be some preaching which has some intellectual quality, and also some rhetoric quality and some literary quality. But it is not enough. We have also a center for meditation, because it was for me a very painful experience that many students converted, were baptized in our church and exercised a very living church. And after they returned to their hometown, and there was one old priest giving the same preaching every Sunday, and three old ladies and so on say, oh, it is the church you introduce us in, and they cannot recognize this church. So, but if we found it, and it was the work of some of my pupils, we founded the spiritual center for courses of meditation. The people are coming for the spiritual exercises, and also very unusual exercises, the spiritual exercises with films. The people are 1 week in absolute silence, and they see the very strong film, and they've got some points how to meditate the message of the film and how it connected with their own life, with their own experiences. And then they have the possibility to speak with the priest or with a psychologist. It's sometimes a man and a lady, and to speak with them about their experiences. And I think this is so important to have so the parishes are almost empty, many parishes. There are less and less priests, and I don't think it will be better. And we cannot just to bring the priests from Africa and from Poland and so on. Perhaps there will be the time for the viri probati, for the married man, but also it will be not the last solution. We need not only the parishes, we need the centers, the spiritual centers with some intellectual and spiritual radiation. And I think it is the secret that to put together these three dimensions. One is the intellectual, the second is the spiritual, and the third is the activity in the civil society. Our students, our young people, young Christians are active in some democratic movements, in some ecological movements, and so on. And I think it's important to put these three things together.
Yeah, concerning the last one, you were at one time being recommended by your friend Václav Havel to be his successor as president of the Czech Republic. You didn't become a politician, but obviously you've maintained a very active role as a public intellectual. In recognition of this and of your work precisely as a religious thinker, you were awarded the Templeton Prize. And you've used this opportunity now to do some research on the beliefs of the unbelievers and the so-called nuns in the West, those who do not believe, but they do believe in something. So you want to also to develop an intellectual dialogue with the unbelievers precisely to go deeper into the beliefs of the unbelievers. Can you tell us something about this research project, where it is now, where it's going?
Sure. So it is an international research project, the faith and beliefs of non-believers. And it is an international project. We've got several cooperatives, and you are yourself invited to give a lecture in this context. And we have there some sociologists, philosophers, theologians to discuss, to discover what it is, this continent of nuns, which is very very living, very important, great. It is the great, it is the third greatest entity after Christianity and Muslims, these nuns. And what are these nuns? They are not atheists. The real atheists are just a small part of these nuns. They are many apatheists. They have nothing against the religion, but they are apathetic. They apathy. They are not interested. The religion is something what has no connection with their life. There are some agnostics, and also among the agnostics is the very different parts. There are some agnostics. They have some some respect in front of the mystery, and others, they are more just apartheid. They say, oh, we cannot rationally solve the problem, the religious problem, so we are not interested in this. There are people that are against the church. They have nothing against the against God, against faith, but against the church, and sometimes I can understand it. And they are also the people so-called spiritual but non-religious. And there's alternative spiritualities and many type of spiritualities, and also with the atheists. I've got 2 days in this week. I've got a dialogue or trialogue with two quite important thinkers, atheist thinkers in our country, and I told them, you know, I respect the atheism. I like the critical atheism. I don't like the stupid militant atheism, but the critical atheism, it's ancilla theologia. It could serve the faith to purify it from fundamentalism, for the naive religiosity. It can help us. So the atheism is like a flame. It's good servant, but a bad Lord. It can serve us to purify us, but I think the atheism is good instrument for believers, but it is dangerous for atheists. Then atheism could become a religion, and if atheism is a religion, it's sometimes very stupid religion. So after this atheist purification, we believers have some deeper faith. And what is the possibility for the atheists? So I think they can help us, but we can also help them, and we need this dialogue. And so there are several types of atheism, of course. I like this atheism, which is the wounded atheism. The people say, I would like to believe, but there's so many tragedies and sorrow in the world. And I always think, yes, we must embrace also this this experience. It is like the experience of the cross. It's like the experience of the dark night. We should say those people, we know also such of moments of crisis, of silence of God, the God who is with this Hester Panim in Hebrew. It is the face of God is hidden, and it is also the religious experience, the loneliness and darkness, and it is the possibility to purify it and to deepen our faith. So it is not an enemy. We should accept it and integrate it, also embrace this.
Well, thank you so much. I think we could continue, but I have to open up to our audience. I see there are some questions, and do please, you have the chance to write to write your question. Let me go through 3 questions I have now already. One comes from Chae Kim, and he's about your experience as a psychotherapist, working with alcoholics and with drug addicts. According to your experience, how psychotherapy could be helpful for your engagement with interreligious dialogue. And also, what is the most lacking dimension of psychotherapy at the present times comparing to or in relation concerning your training with your experience? What do you think is the lacking dimension of psychotherapy today?
Yeah, okay. I'm no more active in the psychotherapy, but for me it was very inspiring the Jungian depth psychology. And especially for the interreligious dialogue, is important this idea of the projection of the shadow and projection of the shadow. Everybody, after Jung, has its own shadow. It's the part of our personality which we are not able or not willing to accept. And the individual persons had their shadow side, but also the cultures and the religions. And sometimes we project these shadows on the others, and then we have the possibility to beat it. And if somebody is provoke us to hatred, sometimes it is because he show us the mirror, and he's like a mirror, and we can see in these enemies our own shadow. What we are provoked by, it is our own shadow. And the Jung wrote that we should introduce to accept this our shadows, to take it back. And if we take back the shadows, if we say it is my problem, it's also my problem, mea culpa, it is my problem, I accept it, so we can liberate our relations between persons and between cultures and between religions. So I think sometimes we are projecting these shadows and on the others, and we should say, oh, we are also like this. We, not only the Muslims were cruel, our crusades were also cruel, and so on.
I have a special question from Ika Kosnarski Casanova, that is from my dear wife. As you know, she is Ukrainian. And the question is, given your experience in the Czech underground Catholic Church, whether there were any contacts, whether you had any knowledge of the Ukrainian Catholic Church in the underground in Soviet Ukraine. It was, after all, the largest underground church in Eastern Europe. And especially after the fall of communism, you visited Ukraine. What it is that you can tell us about specifically the Ukrainian Catholic Church and its unique character within Eastern Europe?
Partly. So during the communist time, we haven't so much information because we were in the ground, they were in the ground, everything was hidden. So there were no exchange of informations. I think that some people from our underground church have some contacts to the underground church in Russia. And there were some cases, some secret bishops, secret ordained bishops, they were discovered murdered perhaps by the secret police and maybe by the KGB, and they were the people, they've got perhaps some contact for the Russian, for the underground church in the Soviet Union. So it may be it was also the Ukraine was the part of the Soviet Union in that time. So some people had. I haven't this contact during the communist time, but after I visited Ukraine, I've got a lecture at a wonderful Catholic, Greek Catholic Ukraine University, and it was a great experience for me. And I spoke with people who've got this personal experience as well.
Thank you. There is a question from Professor Trick. Why is the contemporary religious character of the Czech Republic so different from Slovakia, given some similar background? So what will be the main differences?
It wasn't so similar background. It was quite a different, cultural milieu, because, as I thought already, the Bohemia, the Czech lands, were industrialized, urban country with heavy industry and so on. The Slovakia was more agricultural, and this agricultural village society is a biosphere, cultural biosphere for the traditional religiosity. But in this urban society, in this industrial society, there is there's not enough this cultural biosphere for the traditional religiosity. So it was a problem of secularization of many industrial countries. So there must the church develop a new language and new approach to the people and so on. So there were the great cultural differences and between the Czech and Slovakia. We've got the very similar language, and we've got for this Czechoslovak Republic the common history, but there were also the differences.
Chai Kim, who asked the question of psychotherapy, would like to have conversation with you. So later you can go to the chat and you can find his email address there. Let me have a question about, we always end our conversation about the pandemic, the global pandemic and the lessons of the global pandemic, and how can we prepare ourselves for the post-pandemic world. What is the main lesson and how we could come out of it, particularly in order to build a more solidaristic global order based on love and truth? This was the motto of President Václav Havel. Obviously, the motto has come into crisis in the Czech Republic thereafter, but this was a motto that built upon Jan Hus and the Jesuit Church. So again, as you know, Pope Francis is very much building towards this more solidaristic, post-pandemic global order. So what is the lessons we can draw from this experience?
I wrote a book about it. I published it in Czech, Polish, German, Portuguese, the collection of my sermons in the empty churches. And because the church was empty during the pandemic era in our country, so I've got my preaching and the camera, and then I collected it in a book. And I also wrote an introduction concerning with this idea, what will be the world after? Because I saw in these empty churches, the title of the book is The Time of the Empty Churches. I saw in this a little bit of prophetic vision, a warning that if the church will not go through a deep reform, the many churches will be empty. Now not only in our country, in many countries, the churches are almost empty. The pre-seminaries are empty. The monasteries are empty. And so these closed churches, it could be a warning vision for the near future. The church must go through so deepening, so deeper spirituality, a new theological vision, and I think it's a vision of this global Christianity. We need this ecumenism also with those seekers, and we cannot just concentrate ourselves on this hardcore of the Christians. We are not a sect, we are the church. The church must be open. The Pope Benedict spoke about the courtyard for Gentiles, but it's not enough to open some space for the seekers inside the church. The Pope Francis, day before his election, he spoke about spoke about this parable of Jesus, that Jesus is knocking on the door, and he said, Jesus is knocking now from inside. He wants to go outside. He go outside the church, and we must follow him. And it is not enough to create a space inside this temple of the church. The temple of the church is sometimes very destroyed, like the temple of Jerusalem. We have one wall, and we must go also outside and to connect all the seekers, the open-minded people, and not just to convert them. It's not enough just to the pastoral care about the believers. It's not enough to have the classical mission to broaden the number of believers. We must accompany the seekers, accompany in mutual respect, in dialogue. We must speak with them, and we must learn something also from them. We should, we have something to offer. We have our tradition, but we should also learn from the others, and we need to accompany them. For me, it's a model, it's an inspiration, the model of the chaplains in hospitals, in prisons, in the army, the universities. They are for all. They're not only for the pious criminals in prison, they are for all. And we must be for all. We are not for ourselves. The church must overcome the egocentrism and collective narcissism. The church must be really open-minded. We should go with the other in dialogue, to tell them something, to offer them something, but also to learn from them. And so this is this fraternity, this culture of the Tutti Fratelli, this vision of the Pope Francis is a great vision, but we must work on it, not only to speak about it. I think especially in this everyday contact with those seekers, with those open-minded people, we should develop this culture of sharing the ideas and experiences.
There is a related question from Paulo Smetsniuk from Lviv. He is the director of the Center for Interreligious Dialogue there, one of the institutes, the Catholic University there, Ukrainian Catholic. And he writes, I have an impression that Christianity can exercise much more power over secular people who never receive religious education. They can perceive Christian novelty in a way that traditional Christians cannot. My question, what are the most important differences in pastoral work between working with young people raised in the Christian tradition and those who have not been?
So I think that both need a conversion. I think that in our parish, there are many people that are coming from the traditional religious milieu, but they recognize in the secular milieu of Prague that they must go deeper. They must overcome the childish traditional education and discover the Christ and the faith again on the new way. And I think it's very similar to this converts. They are coming from the secular media. They are sometimes in better position because they've got not so many prejudices and oculars. They are more fresh and open to the novelty of Christianity. But I think both need a sort of conversion. And yes, it's good if the Christian message is a surprise. It's something new. It's very bad if the people think it is something we know already and we are the expert already for this. One English theologian, he was in Prague and he said, yes, I know some young English people, they don't know, they know nothing about Christianity, but they think they know anything about Christianity. The young people in Czech, they also know nothing about Christianity, but they know they don't know. And it is a better position because they are more open. So.
And this note, and this beautiful note, thank you so much for this wonderful conversation. There are several comments from the question and answer. I would urge you, Thomas, to read them. There is a comment and a note from Laurențiu Tanse, who teaches sociology of religion in the Faculty of Orthodox Theology and Bucharest University, who would like to contact you. So there is his email address. You can get in contact. I will also send him your email address. Father Halík, thank you so much for this wonderful, wonderful conversation. And thank you all. Again, let's hope there will be a 12th episode of the series. We'll keep you informed. And the YouTube of our conversation, the videotape, should be available at the beginning of next week. Thank you again, everybody. Thank you, as always, to Ruth and Gopin and to the other people at the Berkley Center that are making possible this conversation at a distance. So thank you again. Thank you, everybody. Have a great time. Bye.